It was late 1944. The world was burning. On the battlefields of Europe, Hitler's armies were retreating. In the skies above Germany, Allied bombers thundered day and night. And on the American home front, life went on. Thanksgiving was coming. Families across the United States were preparing turkeys, baking pies, and writing letters to sons fighting overseas. But few Americans realized that, quietly, tens of thousands of German prisoners of war, men who had once fought to destroy them, were now sitting in camps across the U.S., staring in disbelief at what they saw on American dinner tables. This is their story, a story of shock, gratitude, and cultural collision. The story of German POWs who couldn't believe the generosity of their American captors during Thanksgiving and Christmas. In the summer of 1943, as the Allies gained control in North Africa, the first major groups of German prisoners were taken, veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps. Thousands of these men, tan, weary, and proud, were shipped across the Atlantic. They expected harsh treatment. They imagined cold prison cells, starvation, and humiliation. After all, that's what they'd been told by Nazi propaganda. But when they arrived, they were stunned. Instead of barbed wire hellholes, they found themselves in well-organized camps. Camps that looked more like small American towns. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Camp Hearn in Texas, and Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners found wooden barracks, clean bedding, libraries, classrooms, even theaters. They were allowed to work for pay, 80 cents a day, in canteen coupons. They could buy cigarettes, toothpaste, even candy. For many, it was more comfort than they'd ever known as soldiers. But what would truly shock them was food. And that shock would reach its peak in late November. Imagine being a 22-year-old German corporal. You were captured in Tunisia 6 months ago. You fought under the blazing sun for Hitler's army. You watched friends die of thirst and bullets. Now you're in the heart of America, Kansas or Texas, working on a farm under guard. You don't know what Thanksgiving means. The word is foreign. The concept unimaginable. Then one day, the camp cooks start preparing something special. The guards smile more than usual. The air fills with smells you haven't known in years. Roasted turkey, buttered rolls, spiced pumpkin pie. And on that Thursday in late November, the prisoners are told, "Today is Thanksgiving." Everyone eats together. At Camp Swift in Texas, German prisoners later recalled that they were stunned by the abundance. They were served roast turkey with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, and slices of pumpkin pie. Coffee flowed freely, and no one, not one prisoner, went hungry. In German POW diaries found decades later, one man wrote, "We were the enemy, yet they fed us like honored guests." I could not understand this. Was it a trick? Number. It was genuine. Another recalled, "In the desert, we had eaten sand and dust. In America, they gave us turkey and cake. It was like waking from a nightmare." The generosity wasn't accidental. It was by design. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war had to be treated humanely and given rations equal to those of the captor's own soldiers. And in the United States, that rule was taken seriously. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office issued clear orders: all prisoners of war shall receive the same rations as U.S. troops stationed nearby. That meant steak, milk, butter, eggs, and yes, turkey at Thanksgiving. Even during wartime rationing, American camps honored the holiday spirit. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the cooks prepared over 1,200 turkeys for POWs and guards alike in 1944. At Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, they baked 2,000 pies. And at Camp Aliceville in Alabama, one of the largest POW camps in the South, the German prisoners were astonished to see American soldiers carving meat for them, not the other way around. For Germans raised under strict Nazi discipline, where Allied prisoners often suffered deprivation, this was unthinkable. Kindness from the enemy? It didn't fit the world they'd been taught to believe in. The first Thanksgiving dinners created more than just full stomachs. They sparked deep conversations and culture shock. Many German prisoners had never seen such a mix of people. African American cooks and guards worked alongside white officers. Mexican farmhands greeted them in broken German. And all of it, the diversity, the informality, defied the racial hierarchy they had been indoctrinated to follow. One prisoner at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, later told a Red Cross interviewer, "In Germany, we had been told that America was chaotic, full of lazy people and criminals, but I saw something else. They worked hard, they laughed, they treated each other like equals." At the dinner tables, German POWs often found themselves discussing freedom and democracy with American guards. One young guard in Texas remembered, "We sat across from these Germans. Some were die-hard Nazis, some were just tired boys. I told them this was Thanksgiving, a day to be thankful we're alive. They didn't understand at first, but after dinner they smiled. Some even said, 'Thank you.'" Officially, German prisoners were not allowed to write about camp conditions in detail. Letters were censored, but many still tried to describe what they had seen, carefully, between the lines. A German sergeant wrote to his wife in December 1944, "The people here eat better than we ever did, even in peace. You would not believe the abundance. I wish I could send some home." Another POW wrote, "They celebrate something called Thanksgiving, when they thank God for food and freedom. It is strange, but beautiful." Censors cut out many such lines, but fragments survived. After the war, these letters stunned families in Germany. They had imagined their men starving in American prisons. Instead, they learned they'd been fed holiday feasts. This created a quiet ripple through post-war German memory. For many former POWs, Thanksgiving became their first glimpse into what Americans truly valued: gratitude, generosity, and community. To understand how shocking this kindness was, we need to look at the contrast. In 1943 and 1944, millions of Allied POWs in German hands faced hunger, freezing cold, and fear. British and Soviet prisoners often suffered terribly. Even Western prisoners of war, though treated under Geneva rules, faced shortages as Germany collapsed. So, when captured Germans found themselves in American camps, well-fed, healthy, and celebrating holidays, they couldn't help comparing. Some felt guilty, others felt confused. A few even felt admiration. One former Wehrmacht lieutenant later told an interviewer in 1975, "They beat us in war, but they never humiliated us." That was America's greatest victory. At Camp Concordia, the American Commandant, Colonel Clifford G. Hennies, decided to hold a combined Thanksgiving service in 1944. He invited local townspeople, guards, and German prisoners to join in prayer. The chaplain spoke about forgiveness and peace. When the choir sang, "Now Thank We All Our God," the same hymn known in both English and German, many POWs cried silently. For men who had fought for a regime built on hate, it was a strange kind of grace. During late 1944 and 1945, many German POWs worked on American farms and factories. Labor shortages meant farmers needed help, and the U.S. military allowed prisoners to assist under guard. In Kansas, Colorado, and Iowa, they harvested corn and wheat. In Georgia and Alabama, they picked cotton and repaired fences. Their pay went into canteen credits, which they used to buy chocolate, postcards, and toiletries. Many American families grew fond of these men. They brought them water, lunch, or small gifts, and during Thanksgiving and Christmas, kindness deepened. Farm families would sometimes bring slices of pie or homemade bread to the POW work details. Guards allowed them to share it. For the Germans, it was shocking and deeply humanizing. A diary from Camp Algona, Iowa, recorded, "Today the farmer's wife gave us warm bread and jam. I felt ashamed. My hands were dirty, my uniform torn. Yet she smiled. I will never forget that." That simple gesture carried more weight than any political speech. After the November feasts, the camps began to prepare for Christmas. The American officers knew that for Germans, Weihnachten, Christmas, was a sacred time, and despite the war, they allowed the prisoners to celebrate. The Red Cross and YMCA provided decorations, candles, and music sheets. The prisoners built wooden Christmas trees from scrap lumber and painted stars from cardboard. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, they even staged a Christmas play. In Camp Aliceville, the prisoners' choir sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in perfect harmony. Guards and officers stood silently as the melody filled the night air. Many had tears in their eyes, and on Christmas Eve, once again, the prisoners were given a feast. Roast ham, potatoes, peas, fruitcake, and coffee. Some camps even handed out small gifts, shaving kits, cigarettes, or stationery. At Camp Concordia, American guards distributed Christmas cards with a simple message: "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." One German sergeant, years later, recalled, "It was the first time I believed peace might really come. The Americans showed us that mercy was stronger than hatred. Not every German POW was moved. Some were bitter. Some remained loyal to Hitler until the end. Within the camps, secret Nazi groups tried to enforce discipline, even punishing those who showed weakness. But for thousands of others, these holiday meals became moments of reflection. They began to see America not as propaganda had painted it, decadent and weak, but as powerful precisely because of its compassion. The American approach to POW treatment was not purely sentimental. It was strategic. By treating prisoners well, the U.S. hoped to encourage surrender and undermine Nazi morale. And it worked. By late 1944, thousands of German soldiers willingly surrendered to American troops, saying they preferred captivity in America to dying in a hopeless war. Word had spread, through letters, through whispers, that the Americans feed you well. Yet for those who experienced it firsthand, the shock was deeper than food. It was the realization that their enemies could be humane, that the world they'd been taught to hate was not full of monsters, but ordinary people who celebrated gratitude and peace, even with their foes. After the Thanksgiving meal, the prisoners usually returned to their barracks. The guards would patrol quietly. Sometimes they heard harmonicas or singing in German. Sometimes laughter. One guard at Camp Hearn remembered. They were like boys again. For one night, they forgot they were prisoners. In that silence after dinner, many wrote letters or poems. Some prayed. Some simply sat, thinking of families far away and wondering if they would ever see them again. One German private, age 19, scribbled a few lines in a small notebook. Today, I ate turkey and pie. I thought of my mother and how she would smile. I'm thankful, though I do not understand why my enemies feed me like this. That note was found years later in an archive, still folded neatly. For Americans, Thanksgiving was ordinary, even routine. But through German eyes, it looked like something sacred. A people pausing in the middle of war to give thanks, to share food, to show generosity. It contradicted everything they had been told about the decadent West, and it left a lasting impression. After the war, many former POWs returned to Germany and became teachers, engineers, and businessmen. Some joined organizations promoting democracy. A few even emigrated back to America. They often spoke of their first Thanksgiving as a turning point, the moment they realized that strength could come from kindness. One former POW, Kurt Müller, who later moved to Illinois, said in a 1982 interview, "I came as a prisoner. I left with a lesson. Freedom feeds even its enemies." By 1946, nearly 400,000 German prisoners had lived in U.S. camps. Almost all experienced at least one Thanksgiving or Christmas under American care. When they were finally repatriated, many carried memories of warmth, of food, of music. The turkey dinners became symbols of a strange paradox: humanity in the middle of the most inhuman war in history. Historians later called it the diplomacy of compassion. It helped shape post-war relations, laying groundwork for the reconciliation between former enemies. Even today, some small towns in Kansas, Texas, and Iowa still remember the Germans who worked their fields, polite, hard-working men who disappeared after 1946 but left behind carvings, murals, and stories of gratitude. And in Germany, a few of those men passed down a unique family tradition, celebrating Erntedankfest, the German harvest festival, with a new dish on the table: roast turkey, an American tradition, reborn across the ocean. As the plates were cleared and the camp lights dimmed that Thanksgiving night in 1944, a quiet truth lingered over the barracks. War had brought them to America as enemies. But for one evening, over turkey and pie, they were simply men, alive, fed, and grateful. That simple act of kindness, a meal shared with the enemy, would echo across decades, reshaping how thousands of German soldiers saw the world and how they would remember America. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest and darkest of the war. In Europe, the Battle of the Bulge raged in the Ardennes. German troops, desperate and undersupplied, were pushing through snow and fire in a last-ditch offensive. Tens of thousands were dying on both sides. But across the Atlantic, in 1,000 camps scattered across America, a different kind of winter was unfolding. Here, behind barbed wire, thousands of German prisoners of war were preparing for Christmas, a Christmas unlike any they had ever known. They were prisoners, yet they were fed, clothed, and warm. They were enemies, yet they were allowed to sing their songs and light their candles. And above all, they were treated as human beings in a time when humanity seemed lost. This is the story of Christmas behind barbed wire. By December 1944, the US held more than 375,000 German prisoners in over 500 camps across 46 states. From the deserts of Arizona to the pine forests of Wisconsin, these camps were small cities unto themselves. Each had its own rhythms: morning roll call, work details, meals, recreation. But as Christmas approached, something changed. The atmosphere softened. Even guards, who were usually strict, found themselves relaxing the rules. The prisoners decorated their barracks with pine branches, paper stars, and hand-carved ornaments. They sang carols, exchanged handmade gifts, and wrote letters home. In Camp Aliceville, Alabama, German artisans carved wooden toys for the guards' children. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, prisoners built a large wooden nativity scene and placed it in the center of the camp square. The Americans let it stay there, untouched. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a Red Cross truck arrived loaded with special Christmas rations, chocolate bars, raisins, nuts, and cigarettes. For men who had once faced starvation on the Eastern Front, it was like a miracle. For most Germans, Christmas, Weihnachten, was the most emotional time of the year. It wasn't just about religion. It was about family, memory, and tradition. Even hardened soldiers longed for the smell of pine trees and the sound of church bells. Inside the American camps, that longing ran deep. Prisoners gathered around makeshift trees, sang old carols like O Tannenbaum and Leise rieselt der Schnee, and read from the Gospel of Luke. They shared stories of home, mothers baking cookies, children waiting for Christkind, the Christ child, to bring gifts. For a few hours, the war seemed far away. A former POW named Hans Goebel, who spent Christmas 1944 at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, later recalled, "We had nothing but what we made with our hands, yet it was beautiful. We sang quietly so as not to disturb the guards. Then they came and stood at the door, listening. One of them, an American from Chicago, said he hadn't heard carols like that since his grandmother died. We were all homesick together." That was the strange paradox of captivity. Both sides, the guards and the prisoners, were far from home. And on Christmas Eve, they found comfort in each other's presence. Among all the songs sung that winter, one stood above the rest. Stille Nacht, known to Americans as Silent Night. Its haunting melody had crossed borders long before the war. It was German in origin, written in 1818 by Franz Xaver Gruber and Joseph Moore, but by 1944, it belonged to the world. At Camp Algona, Iowa, the German choir rehearsed for weeks. They were allowed to hold a concert for both prisoners and guards on Christmas Eve. The audience included the American commandant, local townspeople, and Red Cross workers. When the choir began Stille Nacht, the entire hall fell silent. Some guards bowed their heads. Some prisoners wept. A local newspaper later wrote, "For a moment, there were no sides, no barbed wire, no war. There was only peace, fragile, but real." Years later, one of the camp's chaplains said that concert was the most human moment of the war. In that song, Germans and Americans found a shared soul. It reminded both that beneath the uniforms and flags, they were the same, men longing for home, for love, and for peace. Religion played a powerful role inside the camps. Many German POWs were devout Christians, Protestant or Catholic, and American authorities recognized their need for worship. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were allowed to practice their religion freely. So chapels were built. German chaplains, captured with their units, were allowed to minister to their fellow countrymen. At Camp Crossville in Tennessee, one barrack was transformed into a church, complete with a wooden altar carved by a POW carpenter. On Christmas Eve, 1944, that small church was filled to overflowing. Guards stood quietly at the back as the chaplain, Father Heinrich Lenz, delivered a sermon in German. "Tonight, we are prisoners in body, but not in spirit. The walls cannot keep God out. The lights we light tonight, they are lights of hope, not only for us, but for all mankind." Afterward, the prisoners sang "O du Fröhliche." One guard, an American Baptist from Tennessee, later said, "I didn't understand a word, but I felt it in my bones. They were praying for the same peace we were." It was a powerful reminder that faith, even between enemies, can bridge the deepest divides. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps took the holidays seriously. Each camp received extra rations for Christmas 1944. Turkeys, hams, canned fruit, nuts, and coffee were distributed according to the same standards as American military posts. At Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners were served roast turkey, mashed potatoes, peas, bread with real butter, fruitcake, and hot cocoa. At Camp Aliceville, they added sweet potatoes and cranberry sauce. At Camp Concordia, the menu included roast beef and apple pie, a luxury almost unknown in wartime Europe. For men used to dry bread and ersatz coffee, it was overwhelming. A POW named Werner Weber wrote in his diary, "It was like eating in a dream. I thought of my mother in Dresden, who probably has no sugar, no milk, nothing. Here I sit, the enemy, and I am given all this. It is too much." Some prisoners couldn't finish their meals, not because they weren't hungry, but because guilt choked their throats. The abundance of the American table stood in sharp contrast to the hunger ravaging Germany. Yet the Americans insisted. "Eat," said one sergeant. "It's Christmas. Everyone eats." Not all guards were friendly, but many were. They saw the Germans as soldiers, not monsters, and Christmas gave them an excuse to show simple kindness. At Camp Tonkawa, guards brought small gifts to the German prisoners: pencils, cigarettes, even soap. In return, the prisoners made presents by hand. One carved a wooden pipe for his guard. Another painted a picture of the camp and gave it to the American officer who ran it. A guard later remembered, "It was strange. We'd been trained to fight them, but that night they reminded me of my own brothers." I think we all realized how senseless war is. The human connections forged during those nights often lasted a lifetime. After the war, Many former POWs kept in touch with their guards through letters, friendships born in the most unlikely of places. Even amid the celebration, the shadow of war never vanished. Censors allowed limited mail, but many prisoners hadn't heard from their families in months. Some didn't know if their parents were alive. Others had lost homes to Allied bombing. On Christmas Day, the Red Cross distributed messages from Germany. Those who received letters often shared them aloud, translating for their friends. Some wept openly. Others sat in silence, staring at the paper for hours. A report from Camp Algona noted that many prisoners seemed emotionally overcome when reading news from home, but were comforted by the kindness of guards and chaplains. For those who received no word, the pain was heavier. One soldier wrote in his journal, "They gave us a feast, but I could not eat. I thought of my wife and little girl, somewhere in the ruins. I prayed that someone somewhere might show them the same mercy I was shown here." It was a moment of mirrored empathy, enemies beginning to wish for compassion on both sides. Music became a bridge of understanding in many camps. German prisoners formed choirs and orchestras using instruments provided by the YMCA or built from scrap. They played Bach, Beethoven, and Christmas hymns. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, the German orchestra performed a concert for the entire camp and local visitors. They played Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, and Ave Maria. The audience, American soldiers and local families, gave a standing ovation. One newspaper wrote, "If one closed their eyes, it was easy to forget these were prisoners. It was simply music, pure and beautiful." These performances reminded everyone that culture, art, and humanity survived even in captivity. For the Germans, it was a way to reclaim dignity. For the Americans, it was proof that compassion was stronger than hate. For many prisoners of war, that Christmas marked a psychological turning point. By then, most knew the war was lost. News of Allied advances and German cities in ruins reached them through newspapers and guards' conversations. Instead of despair, some found a strange peace in their captivity. They began to see it as a kind of sanctuary, a pause between destruction and rebuilding. A prisoner named Otto Reimer wrote, "I stopped hating the Americans that winter. They showed us decency. I realized that if Germany lost but humanity won, then maybe the world could heal." It was not universal. Some still clung to Nazi ideals, but the seeds of transformation had been planted. Christmas became a mirror in which they saw two worlds, the brutal one they came from and the merciful one they were experiencing. And many decided which one they wanted to belong to after the war. For Americans living near the camps, the idea of German soldiers eating Christmas dinner with turkey, pie, and gifts was hard to accept. Some families had sons fighting overseas. Some had lost loved ones. Newspapers occasionally ran angry letters. "Why should the Nazis get turkey while our boys are eating rations in the mud?" But camp officials and church leaders defended the policy. They argued that humane treatment wasn't about rewarding the enemy. It was about preserving American values. A Methodist pastor in Kansas said in his Christmas sermon of 1944, "We feed them not because they deserve it, but because mercy is our strength. The way we treat our enemies today will define the peace tomorrow." Many locals came to agree. Some even volunteered to visit the camps, bringing books and hymnals. A few churches invited select prisoners to attend Christmas services in town under guard. Those quiet acts of decency did more to build post-war goodwill than any treaty. On December 26th, the camps returned to their routine. Roll call, work details, inspections. But something had changed. The men walked a little lighter. Guards greeted them by name. The tension of war seemed to lift, if only for a while. Some prisoners wrote thank you notes in English and pinned them outside the mess hall. One simply said, "God bless America, and may peace come soon." For the guards, those words carried deep meaning. They realized that kindness had done what bullets never could. It had changed hearts. When the war ended in May 1945 and repatriation began in 1946, most German POWs carried their Christmas memories home like treasures. In post-war Germany, they told their families about those strange American holidays, of abundance, laughter, and music behind fences. For people starving amid the ruins, these stories sounded unbelievable. Yet they were true. Many former POWs became informal ambassadors for American ideals. They helped rebuild West Germany, supported democracy, and resisted extremist movements. Some even founded America Häuser, America Houses, cultural centers promoting exchange between the two nations. A few families began their own new Christmas customs, baking pumpkin pie or cooking a turkey in honor of the meals they had once received in captivity. Their children grew up hearing about the Christmas of Mercy, the time their fathers learned that even enemies could share a prayer. Historians later pointed out that the humane treatment of German POWs wasn't just moral, it was strategic. It helped ensure that American prisoners in German hands were treated better in return. It also planted seeds of trust that later bloomed into the US-German partnership during the Cold War. But beyond politics, those holiday moments stand as symbols of hope. In the middle of total war, amid propaganda and fear, ordinary people chose to act with compassion. A soldier's stomach may have been filled that Christmas, but more importantly, his soul was stirred. He had seen another way to live, a world built not on domination, but on dignity. Years later, both American guards and German prisoners reflected on what those dinners meant. Former Guard Sergeant Robert Hines said, "We didn't think much of it then. It was just Christmas. But looking back, I think we showed them what America stood for. We fought with guns, but we won with generosity." Former POW Karl-Heinz Weiss, captured in Tunisia and held at Camp Swift, said, "We were ready to die for Hitler. But America fed us, taught us, and forgave us. That was a greater victory than any battle." Their words echo the same truth, that empathy can disarm even the hardest heart. As 1944 turned to 1945, the war still raged across Europe. But in those quiet American camps, under cold winter stars, there was peace, a fragile, fleeting peace born of simple human kindness. German POWs, far from home, sat together around wooden tables, their plates full, their hearts conflicted, but softened. They sang Silent Night, prayed for their families, and wondered how enemies could show such mercy. And perhaps In that moment, they glimpsed what victory truly meant. Not conquest, but compassion. By the spring of 1945, the guns in Europe finally fell silent. Germany lay in ruins. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed. But across the ocean, in the quiet fields of America, nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war remained behind fences. They were no longer enemies, just men waiting to go home. For them, the Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts they had experienced in captivity were not just holiday memories. They had become symbols of humanity, of contradiction, and of a world they didn't yet understand. And as these men began their journey back to a shattered homeland, the lessons learned over turkey and pie would help rebuild the moral fabric of post-war Germany. The process of repatriating German POWs began in the summer of 1945, but it was slow. Ships were limited, and priorities went first to soldiers from Western Europe and the Pacific. Many Germans remained in the US until 1946, or even 1947. Life after the war in the camps changed. The fences stayed, but the fear was gone. Guards were more relaxed. The prisoners worked on farms, built roads, and helped with reconstruction projects. And in the fall of 1945, even though the war was over, the camps still celebrated Thanksgiving. For the Germans, it was now a familiar tradition. At Camp Concordia, the American officers invited POW representatives to sit at the same table with them for the holiday meal. There were speeches about peace, about forgiveness, and about rebuilding. One American colonel raised a toast. To those who fought bravely, and to the peace we must now keep bravely. The German spokesman stood and replied, haltingly in English, "To America, for showing us mercy when we expected punishment." It was the last Thanksgiving many of them would ever experience, but one they would remember for the rest of their lives. When the prisoners were finally allowed to write home more freely, their tone had shifted. The anger and confusion of 1943 were replaced by gratitude and reflection. A soldier from Camp Herne wrote to his brother in Hamburg, "They treated us as men, not as beasts. On Christmas, they gave us food better than most people at home have seen in years. I do not know how to explain it. They have won us not by force, but by generosity." Another from Camp Algona wrote, "If Germany had shown such mercy to its enemies, perhaps we would not have lost our soul." These letters were read by families in bombed-out houses and refugee shelters. They carried hope, a strange, distant hope that the future could be different. And so, long before any official reconstruction began, seeds of reconciliation were already taking root in the hearts of former enemies. For most German POWs, the American camp experience was their first exposure to democracy, not as an idea, but as a lived reality. They saw guards joking with officers. They saw newspapers criticizing the government without fear. They saw African Americans and white soldiers eating in the same mess hall, though still divided by social inequality. They saw freedom, imperfect, but real. It contradicted everything they had been taught. Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as a degenerate land ruled by capitalists and criminals. But here they were, surrounded by decency, order, and abundance. Even the simple act of being treated fairly was revolutionary. One POW, Friedrich Fritz Schulte, later told a journalist, "I was captured believing I would die in chains. Instead, I learned what freedom looked like. It was not weakness, it was strength." The Americans showed us that dignity is a weapon, too. When the first ships carrying German prisoners docked in Bremerhaven in 1946, the returning men were stunned. The cities they left behind were unrecognizable. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, all rubble. Food was scarce. People were bitter and defeated. But the returning POWs carried something their fellow countrymen lacked: first-hand experience of America's humanity. And many used it to help rebuild. In towns and villages, they became teachers, local officials, and small business owners. Some even founded youth groups dedicated to democratic education. A sociologist later called them the quiet reformers, men who had seen both fascism and freedom, and who chose freedom. They told stories of how their captors had celebrated Thanksgiving with them, how guards had shared coffee and pie, how Christmas had been filled with song instead of hatred. To war-weary Germans, these tales sounded like myths, but they carried moral power. They showed that a different kind of world was possible. After the war, a few German families began to adopt Thanksgiving-like celebrations, inspired by stories from former POWs. They called it Erntedank mit Truthahn, the harvest thanks with turkey. It wasn't widespread, but in towns like Kassel, Augsburg, and Nuremberg, some churches began holding joint Thanksgiving Christmas services in the late 1940s. They used the day to thank God not only for food, but for peace. One German pastor who had been a POW in Texas, Reverend Ernst Kruger, started an annual peace feast in 1948. He served turkey and pumpkin pie to his congregation, recipes he learned in the camp kitchen. His church choir sang Stille Nacht alongside the English Silent Night. In his sermon that year, he said, "When I was a prisoner, my enemy fed me. Today, I feed you, so that hate may never return." That simple act of remembrance helped shape a generation that grew up valuing forgiveness over revenge. Many American guards and former POWs kept in touch after the war. Through letters, postcards, and even visits, friendships flourished. One of the most famous stories was that of Lieutenant James Lewis, who guarded Germans at Camp Aliceville, Alabama. He exchanged addresses with a young prisoner named Helmut Brewer. In 1952, Helmut immigrated to the United States, settling in Illinois. He visited James and his family, bringing a handmade wooden ornament, a small angel carved from scrap wood in the camp. That ornament still hung on the Lewis family Christmas tree decades later. Stories like theirs repeated across the country. Former enemies became pen pals, business partners, even godparents to each other's children. It was proof that compassion in wartime can create peace that lasts a lifetime. The Americans learned lessons too. Many guards were young, barely older than the prisoners they watched. Some entered the job filled with anger and prejudice. By the end, many left changed. A former guard, Private William Beck, later recalled, "I thought they were all monsters. Then I watched them build toys for our kids and sing hymns on Christmas. I realized they were just boys, same as us. That Christmas made me see the point of the war, to stop hate, not feed it." Others carried the experience home to their families. They told their children how generosity could win hearts more effectively than cruelty. In small ways, those lessons filtered into post-war American life, into schools, churches, and veterans groups. The camps, once symbols of war, had become classrooms of humanity. Decades later, historians began studying the POW camps, not just as military facilities, but as social laboratories. They noticed that wherever humane treatment prevailed, post-war reconciliation followed. Dr. Arnold Kramer, author of Nazi Prisoners of War in America, wrote, "The United States turned its prisons into instruments of diplomacy. By feeding and respecting its captives, it demonstrated the moral authority of democracy." He pointed out that the Thanksgiving and Christmas feasts, though small in scale, had immense psychological impact. They turned enemies into witnesses of American ideals. One historian even called those dinners the first lesson in democracy for a generation of future Germans. And indeed, many of those men went on to help found West Germany's new democratic institutions. Some worked in city councils, others in trade unions or universities. Their memories of fair treatment helped them resist the cynicism that plagued post-war Europe. Today, the physical remnants of those camps are fading, but the traces remain. In Aliceville, Alabama, the old campsite has been turned into a museum. Inside, visitors can see handmade ornaments, carved figurines, and diaries written by German POWs. One exhibit shows a wooden nativity scene, built for Christmas 1944, with the words "Friede auf Erden" carved on the base, "Peace on Earth." In Algona, Iowa, the community built a life-size replica of the POWs' original nativity scene. Each Christmas, locals gather there to sing Silent Night in both English and German. The town has even twinned with a German city, symbolizing reconciliation across generations. At Camp Concordia, only a few foundations remain, but local historians still tell the story of how the Germans and Americans shared Thanksgiving dinner under a cold Kansas sky. In each of these places, history lives not in ruins, but in memory, song, and tradition. Thanksgiving, at its heart, is about gratitude. But in wartime America, it became something more. It was a moral mirror reflecting who the nation wanted to be. By sharing the holiday with its enemies, the United States made a statement to the world that freedom was defined not just by victory, but by virtue. It also exposed contradictions. African American soldiers, still facing segregation, often wondered why captured Nazis were treated better than they were. Japanese American families, locked in internment camps, watched German POWs being fed turkey and pie. Those contradictions forced the country to look inward, to question its own values and inequalities. In that sense, the POW feasts were both a triumph and a challenge, proof that compassion could exist even in war, and a reminder that justice must be shared by all. In post-war West Germany, as economic recovery took hold in the 1950s, former POWs often spoke of America with unexpected warmth. Many credited their time in captivity for shaping their worldview. A 1956 survey of ex-POWs revealed that over 70% held positive views of the United States. When asked why, most mentioned fair treatment and humanity during captivity. One respondent wrote, "I remember the turkey, the singing, the laughter. It was there I learned what freedom meant." Another wrote, They taught me democracy not by lectures, but by living it. Those impressions formed the foundation of what became one of the closest alliances of the 20th century between the US and a reborn Germany. Decades after the war, the children and grandchildren of these former prisoners kept the stories alive. Some families still have letters describing the Thanksgiving dinners. Others kept photos of camp choirs singing Silent Night. In both Germany and America, joint remembrance events began appearing in the 1980s and 1990s. Veterans met again, often in tears, embracing men they once guarded or were guarded by. At one such reunion in 1994, marking 50 years since the Christmas of 1944, a German former POW said, "We came as soldiers, we left as men. You gave us back our humanity." His American counterpart replied simply, "And you gave us hope that even enemies can become friends." The story of the German POWs shocked by American holiday dinners is more than a footnote in history. It's a timeless lesson about how nations win peace. In every era, there are wars, divisions, and propaganda that dehumanize the other. But the story of Thanksgiving and Christmas behind barbed wire reminds us that dignity can disarm hatred. When Americans chose to feed their enemies, they demonstrated the true power of democracy, not its weapons, but its compassion. And in doing so, they changed the lives of thousands of men who, in turn, helped shape a peaceful Europe. In 2004, at the small town of Algona, Iowa, a reunion was held. Former POWs from Germany, now old men with grey hair and trembling hands, returned to the site of their wartime captivity. They walked the same ground where they had once stood in uniform. But now they came as guests, welcomed by the descendants of their former guards. Together, they attended a Thanksgiving dinner organized by the town. The menu was the same as in 1944: turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. When dessert was served, one elderly German stood up and said, 60 years ago, I sat in this camp and ate this same meal. I was your enemy then, but you fed me. You made me see that mercy is stronger than hate. I have never forgotten it." The crowd rose in applause. Some cried. And for a moment, time disappeared, replaced by gratitude that had survived generations. In the end, the story of German POWs and their shock at American holiday generosity isn't just about food. It's about the quiet power of empathy. A piece of pie can be an act of diplomacy. A song shared across languages can become a peace treaty. A simple dinner can change the course of a man's life. History remembers battles and treaties, but it's often the small moments, the ones with laughter, warmth, and kindness, that heal the deepest wounds. Thanksgiving and Christmas behind barbed wire were those moments. They didn't end the war, but they proved that even in its darkest hours, humanity could still shine. As the years passed, the men who once sat at those long wooden tables grew old and passed away. But their stories endure in museums, in letters, in family traditions, and in the moral conscience of two nations. They remind us that gratitude is not weakness and compassion is not surrender. They are the true victories of peace. So the next time we gather at a table, free and warm, we might remember those men, once enemies, later friends, who discovered the meaning of Thanksgiving and Christmas behind the fences of war. Because in the end, history's greatest miracle is simple. Enemies can share a meal, and in doing so, become human again.